It's time to attack white nationalism for the terror group it is. Editors note the opinions in this article are the authors, as published by our content partner, and do not necessarily represent the views of MSN or Microsoft. President Trump was right. The special pleading, Tarrant may have been a lone shooter when he slaughtered 50 people at 2 mosques in New Zealand on Friday, but he was not a lone wolf. He was part of a much, now, before it grows any stronger, should be the time to move against it with the same kind of concerted international focus of attention and resources that were trained on Osama bin Laden. Now is the time, but no, that's not likely to happen. As the Daily Beast, nobody can claim as the George W. Bush administration did that we're going to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them here, because they are already here with a vengeance, steadily increasing their power and presence in Western democracies. Networks of white nationalist apologists, sympathizers, supporters, and facilitators pivotal to any terrorist movement are deeply embedded in the political and social fabric. They are literally the obsession with the border wall, the attempts to ban all Muslims. So such measures are trending in Tarrant's direction because Trump's base buys into them. And when it comes to one of the most chilling moments in the congressional testimony last month of Trump's consigliere, the infamous Michael Cohen, came when he said, "I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, that there will never be a peaceful transition of power." I have been told by a very senior former U.S. intelligence official that he is concerned if Trump is impeached and removed, the result could be violence tearing the country apart. And Trump himself, in a weird aside, in the middle of an otherwise soporific dialogue about former House Speaker Paul Ryan, Trump declared, "I have the support of the police, the support of the military, the support of the bikers for Trump. We have the tough people, but they don't play it tough until they go to a certain point, and then it would be very bad, very bad." That was widely interpreted as a veiled threat of violence because, clearly, it was one. So, if we are going to think seriously about a global war on white nationalist terrorism, we have to admit that the American president is an enormous obstacle. But let's say he has a radical change of heart or is defeated in 2020 and the American government decides that the time has come to remove those elements from the military and the police that Trump is talking about who support his very thinly disguised racist agenda because, let's be clear, there are many of them, even if they are not in command. Could that be done? Putting aside the treat, provocateurs like Tarrant are hoping for draconian measures, looking to provoke a conflagration. Civil war in this. When Tarrant writes in all caps, "The myth of the melting pot must end," and with it the myth of the egalitarian nation, he is not coming up with his own lunatic theory, but parroting ones that have been disseminated for years by American racists, and developed into an ideology in Europe as resonant of terror today as Mein Kampf was in the 1920s. Vladimir Putin and his ideologues are apostles of ethnic and linguistic nationalism, and promote it both overtly and covertly in Western European countries to disrupt and divide their democracies. Parties running on anti-brown or black immigrant platforms are now significant players in the politics of Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and Italy. We know that Tarrant, but as the popular French daily Le Parisien headlined on Saturday morning, 49 dead in New Zealand. Everything started in Francia. In 2017, Tarrant came here to watch the presidential election between Emmanuel Macron, who represents everything from globalization to higher education that the Tarrant crowd hates, and far-right Marine Le Pen, who, he concluded, was just not racist enough for his tastes. But the key to Tarrant's thinking and to his connections is in the title of his manifesto, The Great Replacement, drawn directly from the work of far-right French author Renaud Camus, who has written that the fecund peoples of Africa and the Muslim world will overwhelm and replace European populations. As the Daily Le Monde pointed out, the fantasy of this sinister replacement plot originally was based on the notion that the Jews were out to diminish or subjugate the white population of Europe, a notion that endured in right-wing circles even after World War II and the revelations of the Holocaust. And it is still a but here in Europe in the 21st century, where many countries treat expressed anti-Semitism as a crime, Renaud Camus put a new spin on that replacement fable following September 11, 2001, by claiming Muslims were colonizing Europe. On Friday, Camus denied any incitement to terrorism in his own particular way. The colonized, it might be possible to silence such voices of hate. Many European, almost certainly not. At the end of the day, and the beginning, as difficult as the task may be, the war on white nationalist terrorism has to be fought as a war of law enforcement and a war of ideas. Police and prosecutors loyal to democratic values have to pursue investigations into white nationalist groups with the same zeal that has been applied to radical Muslim terrorist organizations. Voters in Western nations have to understand that the fellow travelers of white nationalist terrorism are not acceptable participants in modern democracies, and vote them out, or see that they are prosecuted, or both. And the very first step in that process is to quit making excuses for inventing euphemisms. The fight is not a
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up in the park,